Morning, 10 o'clock. Members present, Actuarial Committee of the Pension Review Board will please come to order. Ms. McLaughlin, would you please call the roll call?
Steve Brainerd.
Here.
Marcia Dush.
Here.
Stephanie Libby.
Ms. Libby is not able to join us today. A quorum is present. Members have received minutes of the last meeting. Any corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes as distributed.
So moved.
Second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Ayes have it. Opening remarks from committee members. This is an opportunity for committee members to provide any remarks they have before getting further into the agenda. Discuss. Any comments outside of the agenda?
No, thank you.
Nor do I. Thank you. We will now accept comments from the public. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes, whether you're here in person or remotely. Now is your opportunity to speak to the committee. Please come forward. Hearing and seeing no one, we will proceed on the primary order of business today, which is the updates on upcoming rule review and possible need for funding soundness restoration plan rule revisions for statutory recommendations. I'd like to please call on David Fee, staff actuary, and Tamara Ehrenstein to present item 6. Ms. Ehrenstein is the staff attorney. Welcome.
Good morning. Committee members, Tamara Ehrenstein, General Counsel, presenting with David Fee on the FSRP rule and statute review. All right, so first an overview of our presentation. We'll provide some background on the FSRP requirements and where we currently stand. We'll provide an overview of the rulemaking process and timeline, as well as opportunities for stakeholder feedback. And then we'll go over some initial concepts for potential rule and statute changes. Please jump in with questions and feedback at any time.
Mara,
Yes.
can you please lean into your microphone? Yes.
Is that better? Better. Okay. All right. So first, the purpose of this review is twofold. Statute requires that all agencies review their administrative rules every 4 years to determine whether the initial need for the rule still exists. Agencies must then adopt with changes, or repeal the rules. As you'll remember, the PRB reviewed all other chapters of rules in 2023 through 2024, but the FSRP rules were initially adopted in 2022 after the FSRP statute update in 2021. So they are due for their first 4-year rule review. The initial deadline for FSRPs under the revised statute recently passed on September 1st, 2025. So the rule review is well timed for the committee and the full board to evaluate how the current rules are working and any changes that may be needed. Additionally, the rule review poses an opportunity for the PRB to identify potential statutory recommendations that cannot be made in rule, but may merit legislative action. All right, so I will hand it over to Mr. Fee.
So this is an overview of key requirements for FSRPs triggered on or after September 1st, 2025. In the context of PRB rules, these are the 4 main areas to consider. We'll want to look for each one at how well they're defined in statute and how well they've been working. So the due date going forward is within 2 years of the triggering evaluation date. The periodic updates are progress updates due to the PRB 1 year after the triggering valuation date, and then every 6 months thereafter. Member communication revolves around the mandatory disclosures of inadequate funding arrangements to members. And then the submission form is the FSRP submission form that accompanies every FSRP that goes to the PRB, and that fosters complete documentation. For progress through September 1st, 2025, though there is some room for improvement, overall the FSRP process has gone fairly smoothly. We've had 12 systems complete FSRPs under the new statute, and we had 2 more that were due by September 1st and are expected to be completed soon. And as a reminder, in the current statute, there's no statutory consequences for missing the deadline, which we'll discuss more later. No systems have triggered the FSRP with valuation dates dated after September 1st. Most systems provided regular updates as required, but many questioned what information should be included in the updates. So that's a potential issue to address in the rules. The FSRP submission form worked well to ensure submitting systems included all required documentation. So that's probably not a huge area of concern in the rules. Excuse me. And we are uncertain if systems adhere to communications requirements. So a potential rule might call for documentation to be provided to the PRB of communications to the members. There are 3 key differences after September 1st, 2025. There's now an immediate trigger if the funding period exceeds 30 years and the funded ratio is below 65%. The deadline for voluntary FSRPs has passed, so we had 1 voluntary FSRP, and that will be our only one. And then the required full funding date is changing in that it used to always be September 1st, 2055, based on the initial September 1st, 2025 due dates. But now going forward, it'll be within 2 years of the triggering valuation date. So if the triggering valuation date is January 1st, 2026, systems must reach a 30-year funding period by January 1st, 2028. So an FSRP would then need to demonstrate full funding by January 1st, 2058. Theoretically, then, a system with a 32-year funding period as of January 1st, 2026 could have triggered an FSRP, but also satisfy the requirement with no changes. But they would be putting themselves at extreme risk of a more severe revised FSRP in the near future. And remember, those revised FSRPs include actually determined contribution rates, 25-year funding periods, and the list goes on. So now I'll hand it over to Ms. Ehrenstein.
All right, so now, all right, there we go. Now the rulemaking process and timeline. This presentation kicks off this effort. So today we're looking for feedback from the committee on the initial concepts presented. We'll provide a similar presentation to the full board at the February board meeting, and we anticipate bringing the notice of proposed rule review for the board's consideration at that time. This includes publication notifying stakeholders and the general public that the PRB is reviewing the FSRP rules and triggers a 30-day formal public comment period. We also intend to seek additional stakeholder feedback at this time on the current rules and statute and the initial concepts presented to the committee and the board. In April, we will appear before this committee again to present more detailed potential rule changes and statutory recommendations, and after that, we will seek additional stakeholder input. We will present draft rules to the full board in July, and that will begin another 30-day formal public comment period after those are published in the Texas Register. And then at the September board meeting, the board could adopt any potential rulemaking and legislative recommendations. In the end of the calendar year, following any such adoption, staff would work on implementing any rule changes, such as providing guidance and training on any changes for stakeholders, as well as include any statutory changes recommended by the board in our biennial report, which would be published in, or will be published in November. Our rulemaking process allows for ample opportunity for stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned on the previous slide, with both the formal public comment periods required under the Administrative Procedure Act, as well as additional informal opportunities to engage with stakeholders to get their feedback on rule changes being considered, as well as statutory recommendations considered. As part of these efforts, we will coordinate with TexPERS and TELFRA to reach their members, and we do plan to present at the TELFRA conference in May on the FSRP rules. In general, we distribute our calls for stakeholder feedback as broadly as possible, and we also do anticipate some targeted outreach to those systems that have been through the FSRP process. So I will turn it over now back to Mr. Fee to go over the rule and statutory concepts.
So later we'll look at potential statute changes in the Texas Government Code, but first we'll look at potential rule changes in the Texas Administrative Code. So 610.13 is our definitions. We could consider striking the definition for voluntary FSRPs and striking those references throughout the rules. But we do have one system that's still under a voluntary FSRP, even though the eligibility expires September 1st. We had one that submitted before then. So it may be preferable to keep that wording in until that system's no longer under their compliance corridors. So in that case, we could still modify language to demonstrate that voluntary FSRPs were in the past. So 610.14 is applicability. And again, the same thing. We could remove references to voluntary FSRPs or simply modify the language to reflect that they were previously authorized. 610.15 deals with requires disclosure of inadequate financing arrangements to plan members. Remember that 802.106 of the government code says systems must disclose an inadequate funding arrangement to members. And then our rule 610.15 clarifies that if an actuary has deemed the funding period to be 30 years or longer, then they have deemed it to be an inadequate arrangement. So if the funding period is longer than 30 years, the system must notify the members of that inadequate arrangement. The PRB could consider adding a requirement that systems provide a copy of those communications to the PRB, and that would ensure systems comply with this requirement. We could also, in addition to that, include guidance and/or sample language so systems know what information to include in those statements. .20 is criteria for determining adherence to a legacy FSRP. We do have one system still under a legacy FSRP, so these rules are still likely needed for a while. But we could consider rephrasing some of the language to be more specific. So currently it reads, a system would be considered compliant if plan experience exceeds a corridor in a favorable way. But we don't define what favorable way means specifically. We could modify it to read, a system would be considered compliant if plan experience exceeds the funded ratio minimum threshold or falls below the funding period maximum threshold. And that way we're defining what favorable way means. And this would also apply to section 610.32, which deals with the corridors for revised FSRP exemptions. And then in addition, we could clarify some language with just some minor technical changes. 610.21 deals with completion of a legacy FSRP. And again, we still have one such system, so those rules are likely needed to be as they are. 610.30 deals with submission and completion criteria for the FSRP. We could consider clarifying the deadline for formulating and reaching full funding. Currently, the paragraph 2, we've been focusing on item B, which is September 1st, 2025. But going forward, we'll be focused on item A, which is the second anniversary of the triggering valuation date. So if you trigger the valuation on January 1st, 2026, it will be due January 1st, 2028. And then 30 years beyond that brings us to a full funding date of January 1st, 2058. So any analysis from the actuary would need to demonstrate that the plan would be fully funded by January 1st, 2058. So a potential rule could restate this requirement in plain language to ensure systems and sponsors understand that any such analysis must show a full funding date within 32 years of the triggering valuation date. .31 deals with compliance with progress updates. Currently, the progress updates vary significantly. We receive letters that vary in level of detail. We also sometimes just meet with the systems regularly in lieu of a letter. And these updates are sometimes just from the system or sometimes a joint letter from both the system and the sponsor. We definitely value those joint letters because they demonstrate commitment from all parties involved. More detail on these requirements, either in rule or in guidance, may be helpful and yield more meaningful updates. We can also clarify the dates for those progress updates and strike outdated references, since no progress updates are needed anymore for the voluntary FSRP or FSRPs that were triggered well in the past. So now, rather than rules, we're going to be talking about potential changes to the statute. So these are 4 potential topics for statutory recommendations. The first bullet deals with the many municipal systems that require legislation to make changes. So it becomes redundant once that legislation has been passed to then require the city council and system board to approve the FSRP. The second bullet deals with unilateral submission. So if, say, a plan sponsor makes all the necessary contribution changes to satisfy an FSRP, and they ask for no changes from the members, under the current statute, that would not complete an FSRP because it's not a joint submission. And so the question would be, would we want there to ever be a situation where that could happen? The third bullet deals with noncompliance. So besides our noncompliance policy for FSRPs, which include things like reporting to the legislators, do we want any consequences in statute for when a system misses an FSRP deadline? And then the fourth bullet deals with section 802.216, which applies only to Fort Worth employees. So we have 802.215 that applies to all systems other than Fort Worth. And then we have 802.216 that deals with only Fort Worth. And now that Fort Worth employees has graduated from their legacy FSRP, could it make sense either now or in the future to combine 2015 and 2016 into one section? So that concludes my remarks, and we're open for questions.
Discuss questions.
Yes, or just a comment. On the unilateral submission, I do have some concerns there. And that is that, again, we're trying to support funds working with their plan sponsors. So from a just a moving forward situation, I would prefer to see that we do not go with unilateral submission for that reason. But I also have a concern, and it's kind of the flip side of what you mentioned, Mr. Fee, which is that I would have a concern that a fund could make unilateral benefit changes. For example, choose a lower benefit formula for new hires in order to meet the requirements without considering the sponsor's attitude for that. And this, again, if you consider pension benefits part of a compensation package, the design of the plan to me is extremely important. And so again, I would not want the fund to be able to make a unilateral submission. And again, I would continue to like to encourage the plan funds work together with their plan sponsors.
Thank you, Ms. Dush. I think that's a point well taken, and over the coming months, we and everybody will have an opportunity to weigh in on that issue. I guess I'd like to just say that, in the larger scheme of things, the FSRP statute is relatively new. It hasn't been around that long. And it really has become the centerpiece for pension reform in Texas, particularly among the local plans. It has raised awareness of pension funding problems, and I think facilitated a lot of solutions. We're now on version 2 of FSRP statutes, and we may be headed for version 3, and I think each one is better than the one before. And I think it's going to be an improvement to the extent that we can revise these rules and persuade the legislature to make statutory changes. This is, I think this is a really interesting and unique statute that the state of Texas has. And look forward to seeing what our stakeholders have to say about it.
Mr. Briner, I would also like to comment that I'm very supportive of additional rules regarding communication with members. Because again, I feel that there has been some lack in really educating and informing members about the funded status of their retirement programs. And I feel that to the extent that members know more about their program, their plan, that they will in fact, elect better representation and have better outcomes. So I would encourage looking at requiring some sort of assurance that members are being informed if there is more than a 30-year amortization period.
Yeah, well, we'll be talking about it in the coming months. It's a good point. Okay, Mr. Fee, Ms. Aaronstein, thanks for your presentation. That's all we have on that. We're not slated for action. Update on that. Any other items that the member would like to add to the future discussion?
Not at this point.
So this committee is scheduled to meet next April 30th, 2026. And the next meeting of the full pension review board will take place February 25th at 10 o'clock with the location TBD. And if there is no further business, no objection, I would move to adjourn this meeting.
So moved.